Hypersonic weapons pose even further upsetting this already tense offense-defense interrelationship and perpetuating a competitive cycle of one-upmanship.
That's the voice of Shannon Bugis, Research Associate at the Arms Control Association. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Colleen and Michelle Doe.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Michelle, it's great to see you again. I can tell by your environs that you're in the Washington office. I'm hoping you were in Washington for this weekend because the weather, as anyone in the D.C. area knows, the weather this weekend was just incredible. I went for a long bike ride. I went to the Tacoma Park Street Fair that was canceled last year because of COVID, but they had it this year. So it was just all around a terrific fall weekend. And how about you, Michelle? Do you have a favorite fall activity?
Oh, I think one of my favorite fall activities is picking apples. True Washington State girl over here. But I was actually up in Boston, so I got to see New England get divided over Patriots versus Tom Brady, was my understanding of what that game was. And it sounds like Tom Brady won yet again. But what was actually in the news this week, Tom?
Well, the big news last week was the U.S. and Russia agreed in Geneva to move ahead with arms control talks, which is great. We want those talks to keep going. The sides are represented by U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. Of course, they need to replace the New START Treaty, which expires in 5 years. We don't have a lot more details than that, other than to say that Russia, as usual, wants to limit U.S. missile defenses, which we think the United States should, but good luck with that, Russia. And the U.S. wants to limit Russian tactical nuclear weapons. So there may be some trade space there. But for today, on Early Warning, we'll be discussing North Korea and the North's recent missile tests, prospects for U.S.-North Korean talks, and what the renewed travel ban means for North Korean families.
And after that, I sit down with Shannon Bugos, a research associate at the Arms Control Association. We discuss her and Kingston Reef's new report, Understanding Hypersonic Weapons, Managing the Allure and the Risks. A report very timely. It came out just in time for this North Korean test, which North Korea claims was of a hypersonic missile. So we go more in depth about what we know about the current state of development for hypersonic missiles around the world and what it means for policy, what it means for programs, and what we can do to reduce these threats.
Sounds great. I can't wait to hear that interview myself. And for our listeners, if you like what you hear, please remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback really helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dell, and welcome to Early Warning. Today we are talking about new missile tests in North Korea. After a 6-month pause, the North has started testing missiles again, including a cruise missile, a short-range missile launched from a train, and a hypersonic missile. The UN Security Council met on Friday to discuss the tests, and the North predictably condemned the meeting. To help us understand what's going on here, we have Colleen Moore. She is Advocacy Coordinator at Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Colleen, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Colleen, how do you interpret the North's recent actions? Is it following some predetermined military development plan? Is it trying to get the Biden administration's attention? Both? Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so I don't think anyone is surprised by this latest round of missile tests by North Korea. So earlier this year in January at the Eighth Party Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, Kim Jong-un outlined a set of nuclear modernization plans. So that indicated intentions to test a hypersonic glider and new cruise missiles, among others. So what we really need to understand is the larger context in which this is happening, specifically the ongoing US-South Korea joint military exercises, as well as South Korea's weapons development as well. So in response to the joint military exercises in August, Kim Yo-jong, who is Kim Jong-un's sister, said North Korea would boost its deterrent of absolute capacity. South Korea has also been testing submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and North Korea has called out the hypocrisy of the US, condemning North Korea's test, but not South Korea's. So, like I said, these missile tests are definitely not surprising. But we're also seeing how the Biden administration's policies are directly contributing to this escalating arms race that we're seeing on the Korean Peninsula right now.
Tell me more about that. How is the Biden administration contributing to this?
So I think they're continuing the hostile policies that we've seen from multiple administrations over the past few decades. I don't think that they're taking a new enough approach that is really aimed at reducing tensions and building trust with North Korea. So they're continuing these joint military exercises, and North Korea, like I said, has particularly, specifically, they responded to that, saying that we will respond with developing our weapons and building up our defenses. They're continuing sanctions. And I just don't think that they are approaching this with a new enough, transformative approach that will address the root causes of these tensions, of these security tensions on the Korean Peninsula. And I don't think it's enough to change the situation. So I do think it is directly contributing.
Now, given that, do you see any prospects for U.S.-North Korea talks along the lines that we saw in the Trump administration? And I would just add here that it appears that the North is still honoring its commitment not to test long-range ballistic missiles. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe that is right. So as far as the talks along the lines that we saw in the Trump administration, so although Sung Kim, who is Biden's North Korean envoy, he said that the U.S. is willing to meet anytime, anywhere. But North Korea hasn't shown any indication that they're interested in engaging with the Biden administration because, like I said, there's no fundamental change in the United States approach. South Korean President Moon Jae-in did call for an end of war declaration at the United Nations General Assembly a few weeks ago, and the Pentagon responded positively that the United States is open to an end of war declaration, which is great. However, North Korea's response was that relations won't improve until the U.S. drops its hostile policy. So like I said, specifically ending the joint military exercises with South Korea and, the strategic weapons aimed at North Korea. So in order for any fruitful conversations between the U.S. and North Korea to occur, the U.S. will need to take a new approach to reduce tensions and build trust, like lifting sanctions, stopping the joint military exercises. And one of the most effective trust-building mechanisms would be negotiating a peace agreement to formally end the Korean War, because that is the root cause of these security tensions. So as opposed to an end of war declaration, which is a non-binding political declaration, a peace agreement would legally terminate the state of war and provide security guarantees for both sides. So really, the ball is in the Biden administration's court right now.
Now, speaking of the Biden administration, they recently renewed the U.S. travel ban on North Korea. Was that surprising to you? And how do you see this affecting Korean families and humanitarian aid?
Yeah, unfortunately, it was not too surprising, just what we've seen from the Biden administration on their overall North Korea policy. We were hopeful that they would lift the travel ban. It was renewed on September 1st of this year, because Biden did say, in his campaign promises, that he wants to reunite separated families. And unfortunately, this travel ban and this unending war is keeping the families separated. So At one point, there were as many as 100,000 Korean Americans with relatives living in North Korea. And time is running out, and time has already run out for many of them who want to reunite with their family members in North Korea. And it has also hindered humanitarian organizations from delivering critical assistance to North Korea. So the administration, on one positive note, they did introduce multiple entry passports for humanitarian workers visiting North Korea, which eases the process somewhat, but we're still concerned that there's too many barriers for humanitarian organizations and private U.S. charities, which will need to move quickly and flexibly once North Korea opens its borders to meet these needs that have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. And also from Women Cross DMZ's perspective, we were doing a lot of people-to-people exchanges, and this ban blocks those exchanges that often create important openings for diplomacy and peace building. And it's also connected, like I said, to the ongoing Korean War, because it's the ongoing war that's at the root of all of these issues: the escalating arms race, the lack of formal relations between the US and North Korea, the continued separation of Korean families. So that's why Women Cross DMZ is calling for the Biden administration to pursue a formal end to the war with a peace agreement, as well as lift the travel ban.
There is the siren, meaning we are out of time. But Colleen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Join us Thursday, October 21 for Press the Button Live. Nuclear policy in the Biden administration and beyond. 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, broadcasting live on Zoom. Every year, Plowshares Fund gathers partners in the nuclear policy community, members of Congress, and listeners like you who are eager to learn more about how we can reset nuclear policy and create a safer world for all. This year, we're adapting our annual Nuclear Policy Forum into our Press the Button podcast format for an inspiring and informative discussion. The virtual forum will be led by Plowshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher and Press the Button podcast co-hosts Tom Kalina and Michelle Dover. Confirmed guests include Chairman Adam Smith of the House Armed Services Committee, California Congressman Ro Khanna, and many more to be announced. For more information and to register for this free event, visit plowshares.org.
Hi, my name is Chase Enright, and I'm the Development Coordinator at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, millennial, or member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues. Because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Plowshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting plowshares.org and donate today.
Shannon Bugis is a research associate at the Arms Control Association, where she contributes research and analysis and reports for Arms Control Today. She previously held roles at the Truman Center for National Policy and Truman National Security Project and in the International Scholars Program at the University of Notre Dame. Now, Shannon, last month, you and Kingston Reef released your co-authored report, Understanding Hypersonic Weapons, Managing the Allure and Risks, which seems very timely given the recent news. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
So, in terms of news, last week, North Korea claimed that it tested a hypersonic missile for the first time. Now, we don't know yet whether that is true, but clearly they have ambitions. What do we need to know about their test?
Thanks for the question. So I would say first and foremost, as you just said, there is still a lack of precise information about what this North Korean test this week exactly consisted of. The potential hypersonic glider looks to have been paired with a missile that has been dubbed the Hwasong-8, and some experts have compared this missile particularly to the Hwasong-12, which is an intermediate-range ballistic missile that can carry nuclear or conventional payloads. This test comes after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, during a party congress in January of this year, noted that research has been completed into, quote, developing warheads of different combat missions, including the hypersonic gliding fight warheads for new type ballistic rockets, end quote. And I want to emphasize here that the term hypersonic refers specifically to speeds 5 times the speed of sound, or Mach 5, and missile systems that can reach those speeds are not new. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, for instance, can hit speeds above Mach 20. So again, we don't know enough about this particular test yet, and guesses are being made from initial photographs and reports. Ultimately, what news of this test should do is highlight the need for more conversation about the hypersonic weapons capabilities under development and those already deployed among the nations who are pursuing these weapons. After all, there are basic questions about hypersonic weapon systems that have gone unasked or unanswered, such as in the case of the United States, for instance, what are the specific missions they are envisioned to fulfill? What is the clear concept of operations and the intended targets for these weapons? And how many of them will be developed and deployed? All of this to say that there is a lack of transparency about each country's hypersonic weapons programs and a lack of transparency among all of the countries who are pursuing these weapons. And transparency, when done well, can be a very good thing by, for example, minimizing risks of false worst-case assumptions between adversaries. Therefore, specifically in this case, in the case of North Korea, the United States should pursue a reestablishment of dialogue with North Korea on its missile and nuclear capabilities. And one of the goals with such a dialogue would be to increase transparency and to pursue risk management and ideally reduction.
You're talking about how several countries are pursuing hypersonic weapons, but that, the element of hypersonic in warfare is not new. But, when I read the newspaper, hypersonic weapons have been called this game changer to warfare. So why are countries pursuing them?
Yeah, so definitely you hit on a popular term to describe hypersonic weapons. It's game changing. But on the whole, there is evidence to suggest that hypersonic weapons are not necessarily a military game changer and are more of an evolutionary development that will not fundamentally alter the nature of conflict. Nevertheless, we see these major power countries pursuing these weapons. So let's talk about the motivations for a minute. Starting with China, Beijing has long shied away from publicly disclosing information on its nuclear forces. And likewise, relatively little is known about their development of hypersonic weapons. But overall, China's motivations for pursuing these weapons appear to consist in part of defeating US missile defenses and overpowering US offensive weapons in the event of a major conflict in Asia. As for Russia, Moscow has made no secret of its stated impetus for its development and deployment of hypersonic weapons, saying they are intended to ensure Moscow has weapons capable of evading any future US missile defenses. Now for the United States, the main military rationale given for the US pursuit of hypersonic weapons by Pentagon officials appears to be to ensure defeat of advancing adversary air and missile defenses and to enable destruction of time-critical fleeting targets. But other officials have focused less on the military benefits and more on the need to win the competition with China and Russia on the development of the technology. These differing motivations raise questions about whether specific military requirements are driving US development decisions, or if the main driver is actually to weaponize the technology now and figure out specific roles and missions later. After all, there are defense officials who are on the record even recently highlighting the still as of yet undetermined parts of US hypersonic weapons programs. Just the other week, for instance, we saw Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall commenting that he hasn't seen all the analysis that's been done to justify the current program. Plus, there are also unanswered questions with respect to production goals and any official programs of record for hypersonic weapons. So as you can see, the motivations vary, and even within the United States, it varies.
So then, you in your report, you've just kind of looked at the state, as you just said, of some of these programs. How realistic do you think it is that you will see these weapons, successfully fielded? I mean, you were just talking about like missile defense, which is something we haven't even really gotten right, and they're pursuing new programs in this area.
Yeah, so we've already seen some hypersonic weapons enter the field. So Russia deployed Avangard, one of their hypersonic systems, in 2019. And so arguably the competition, the competitive nature surrounding hypersonic weapons is already underway. After all, one of the main motivations behind Chinese and Russian development and deployment of hypersonic weapons, like we just talked about, and as you just highlighted, is to possess weaponry capable of evading US missile defenses. Meanwhile, the US cites Chinese and Russian development of hypersonics as justification for building up its own hypersonic weapons and missile defenses to guard against these weapons. So you can already see this competition in this cycle going. And so this can surely be described as like a growing arms race as each tries to best the other. And this is dangerous.
Now, in your report, you argue that more attention needs to be made about this fact that hypersonic weapons can increase the chance of conflict escalation. So setting aside this arms race component, but in an actual conflict setting, it could dramatically increase the ability of conflicts to escalate. What else do you see as underappreciated risks of building these weapons?
Yes, thanks for this question. And that's something that we wanted to focus a lot on this report, is just kind of bringing these risks to light. And we've already touched on one of the risks just previously with talking about this competition. And hypersonic weapons, I want to expand on this a little bit by just saying that hypersonic weapons pose even further upsetting this already tense offense-defense interrelationship and perpetuating a competitive cycle of one-upmanship. So this competition occurs when the acquisition of offensive weapons that pose a distinctive new threat to an adversary typically results in efforts by that state to acquire additional defenses against those weapons, leading to the introduction of ever more capable offensive weapons and so on and so on. And so we're seeing this, as we said, already. Some of the other risks that kind of come to light is, for instance, warhead ambiguity. So ambiguity about whether a hypersonic weapon is carrying a conventional or nuclear payload. And this could trigger a nuclear armed country targeted by a conventional attack to launch its nuclear weapons in response. This risk would be particularly relevant to China's and Russia's hypersonic weapons, as the US currently only pursues conventional hypersonic capabilities. While this is not a risk attributed only to hypersonic weapons, the danger could be greater with these weapons due to their unique flight profile. In addition, hypersonic weapons risk exacerbating threats posed by other emerging technologies. So for instance, the risks posed by the development and the deployment of hypersonic weapons should be assessed alongside the weaponization of other emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence and cyber. To consider hypersonic weapons in isolation fails to understand how technological advancement across multiple areas in the offensive and defensive weapon space can create an overall alarming picture of a nation gaining a market edge over its competitors. In such a case, instability could arise as some countries view their military capabilities as no longer sufficient and race to try to keep pace or get ahead in the competition. And then just one more that I wanted to highlight as well as we're talking about ambiguity, there's also target ambiguity. So under this risk, conventional hypersonic weapons may be able to hold at risk targets that in the past have been immune from attack by conventional weapons. This escalation risk is further exacerbated when the target is a site that houses both conventional and nuclear delivery systems or dual-use command and control systems. An attack on sites like this that intermix nuclear and conventional capabilities could blur the distinction between conventional and nuclear war. And again, that sets up kind of a dangerous scenario.
So what options do we have to constrain these weapons?
So my answer may surprise you or may not, given that I'm coming to you from the Arms Control Association, but I do want to highlight some of the arms control options. Experts in recent years have begun to explore various possible arms control options, ranging from confidence building measures to bans or limits on certain types of hypersonic weapons. Some of these options would be applicable to China, Russia, and the United States, while others may be relevant for only two of the major powers. In addition, there are steps that the United States could take unilaterally to minimize risks associated with these weapons. And I want to emphasize that the pursuit of hypersonic arms control is increasingly important as these weapons transition from an emerging technology and are deployed in greater numbers and on more diverse delivery platforms. So I want to give a few examples of what some of these efforts might look like. First, confidence building measures. And by that, I mean, these are measures meant to promote transparency and stability and can help to lay the groundwork and foster a more conducive environment for a binding agreement. So Some confidence building measures for hypersonic weapons could be a measure in which conventional and nuclear forces are not co-located at the same site. There's also a measure that some experts have suggested, which would be to increase transparency by having an exchange of observers at military exercises involving these weapons, and/or by conducting mutual demonstrations of the systems. An example of hypersonic arms control by way of limits is a potential agreement that caps the number of hypersonic weapons in each country's arsenal, which is similar to the limits constrained by the 2010 New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START. And then there are also some unilateral measures that the United States can take. And one of the main suggestions we have in our report is to cancel the Army's long-range hypersonic weapon program. The rationale for this program is arguably the weakest among current US hypersonic weapon development programs. For one, the weapon is controversial within the Pentagon. A while ago, back in, I think it was April, General Timothy Ray, Chief of Air Force Global Strike Command, said, quote, "I genuinely struggle with the credibility," end quote, "of the Army's plan to develop this hypersonic weapon." So we see that there's already a little bit of infighting here. And there are also issues with finding basing options for this weapon. And lastly, I want to highlight that none of the above cooperative arms control concepts will gain traction in the absence of an active and productive dialogue and ultimately negotiation about hypersonic weapons. Consequently, it is vital for Russia and the United States, as well as China, to engage in professional, regular exchanges of views on the nature of hypersonic weapons technologies, their purposes, and each country's respective perceptions of the potential risks to stability and security that these capabilities may pose. The United States and Russia have already expressed interest in raising hypersonic weapons as a topic in an established dialogue on strategic stability that was restarted in July 2021 and actually just met again on September 30th. Such an opportunity should not go to waste. And then a similar bilateral strategic stability dialogue involving senior US and Chinese diplomatic officials, military officers, and technical experts would also be a good move. And so these are just some of the options that we see laying ahead for hypersonic arms control and cooperation.
Now, for our listeners who, hear this and think, okay, so this is something that needs to happen led by the Pentagon or the State Department, are there other areas that you could see movement, whether in Congress or abroad, that you think there need to be actions taken?
I would answer that question by highlighting kind of the last bucket of options that I had suggested. So some of those unilateral US measures. So canceling a hypersonic weapons program, that's probably going to be a big ask, but that's the type of ask that we can fold into defense spending. So for instance, this year, again, if we're talking about the news, the National Defense Authorization Act is folding these types of asks into legislation like that. Or since that's a tall order, we can start requesting reports from the Pentagon or requesting different reports from, for instance, the Congressional Budget Office about the cost of hypersonic weapons programs. We can start folding those requests into legislation to at least get more information from the US about these programs, about their costs, and about the long-term plans.
Shannon, thank you so much for coming on. Now, where can listeners go to find your report?
You can go to the Arms Control Association website. We have a link there, as well as the Arms Control Association Twitter account, Arms Control Now. We tweet about the report and other news happening that's related.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Alex Hall in Washington, D.C., and Delphine Vigil in San Francisco. Research by Desiree Cepetis and Harry Tarpey. Audio engineering and sound design by Michael Padilla and the Soundport Recording Studio in Grass Valley, California. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.